All right, welcome everyone to another episode of the podcast, Not Quite Strangers. My name is Valerie Hope. I am your host. I'm also a leadership coach and a professional speaker. And it's my pleasure to bring this moment together with two people who do not know each other in this case and have a meaningful conversation. And the whole point is to inspire curiosity, shift our perspective about what it's like to interact with strangers, and build connection. Who knows how they'll show up and what will happen during the result. And ultimately, if you're not already subscribed to this podcast, please do so. Go to www.notquitestrangers.com so that you don't miss this one or any others in your inbox. Now, drum roll for my special guest today. I'll start by introducing Jay. Jay, you and I met about a month ago. No, actually, we met in July. We met in July of 2022. And you were working at the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial Center, Museum. And it so happened that was my second time visiting because I went back a few days before with my brother and his family. And then my other brother said, I want to go too. So I ended up going back. But because I'd already seen the memorial, I was like, I'm just going to hang out in the gift shop. And I'm so glad I did because I ended up hanging out and chatting with you. And you were so like cool and open. And I think I don't know, I hope I didn't take you away from a bunch of customers.
No, you're good. You're good.
And you were just so open and generous with information and your experience. And I was like, all right, Jay, we got to keep this conversation going. And I thought, hey, come on, be on the podcast. And you said yes. So thank you.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yay, thank you. And Shelley, funny enough, I met you the first time I went to the memorial. Jay, you did not know this. This is a surprise. Yeah, so the first time I went to the memorial with my first brother and his family, we were towards the end of the tour, and we were actually about closing time, and I was just kind of hanging out looking at one of the exhibits when Shelley, I met one of your peers who was in the tour group with you, and we just started a conversation, and somehow you all started to kind of come around as we were getting ready to head out. And you and I had a really fascinating conversation about your experience at the memorial and the Equal Justice Initiative and what you got out of it. And also, I don't think until that moment I got the brand of activism that I exercise. So I so appreciate our conversation because it opened up the whole new field for me, or at least a new perspective. And so I thought, you know what, two better people to bring together than the people I met in the same place, different days, but all committed to the same cause. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, why did you guys say yes?
Shelley, would you like to go first?
I can. You know what? I had a really good time talking to you, and you just radiated a positive energy, and it honestly felt like there was an establishment of trust as the kind of person you are in the world, that I was like, yeah, I'll go have a conversation with you and allow other people to hear me have it with a person that I do not know, because somehow you radiated that was still going to be an okay thing to do.
Oh, that's cool. It is an okay thing. It's more than an okay thing. Thank you.
Okay. I would say it was the same, your personality, your talking about your experiences, the podcast and everything. Like you said earlier, the conversation we had was very engaging. It was, lighthearted, fun, but we talked about serious issues and our experiences, and use your energy, and I could not do it. So
Oh, thank you so much, both of you. This is very, very kind. And I don't take it for granted, because the other thing I've learned through this podcast is how much trust is, the element of trust is such an important aspect of how people connect with one another. And I've been learning that over and over again in every single conversation. That seems to be the key for people to want to say yes to us. So for those of you listening, just FYI, if you want people to do stuff for you, make sure that they trust you. Pro tip. So I also started this new tradition just in the last interview I did, because I listened to a podcast called The Diary of a CEO. And in that podcast, they ask the current guest a question that they would like for a future guest to answer. And so I actually have a question for the two of you that was posed by my previous guests. You guys ready? We'll start with that one, and then we'll see where the conversation goes. All right, cool. So the first question that I have for you was, what do you feel you have in common so far with the person that is on the podcast with you?
I feel we both agree that you are a trustworthy and amazing person. We haven't really got the chance to, get in depth with anything, but I could tell Shelly's if you think Shelly and know Shelly has a great vibe, then I'm here for it. Passage of energy and trust and all that. So that's really all I can say.
Fair enough. Shelly, what would you say you have in common?
Well, I guess I'm repeating something you said, which is, the fact that you met both of us at the same location. While I do not work at EJI, the museum or the memorial, it was an important place for me to go to. It wasn't just a thing I happened by. So there is an investment in the mission and justice. And so, Jay, if you're working there, I'm making a bit of an assumption that you believe in the mission of the location.
Oh, yeah.
And therefore, I think that's something that we would have in common.
Oh, your answer was so much better than mine.
Both of them resonate. You both trust me, and you both happen to, really committed. You're committed to the mission of the place that we met. Perfect. So that's question number one, and we might delve into more detail around it, but I want to ask the second question. So the second guest asked, what are the people like in your hometown? When you think about who you are and where you grew up, potentially, like, what are they like? And maybe how they like you? How are they different than you?
Well, being here in Montgomery, it's very true Southern conservative kind of atmosphere. Everybody is Southern hospitality, very nice, but there's always kind of that undercurrent of, how do you say it, like, the bless your hearts, or the type of things that they say, like when they don't want to say like, oh, you're crazy or something. Oh, it's bless your heart.
It is a thing. It is a thing.
It's a true thing. And, but the community here, especially in the past year or so, has really been growing, especially with, the civil rights movement, art in local community and everything. So that's been a really good part of the community and something that I'm really hoping to see more of.
Fascinating. So seeing more of that in your community, that's growing. And funny enough, I mean, being Montgomery, Alabama is the heart of so much of the civil rights movement. So it's interesting to see that you find it is increasing now.
Yeah.
Did it die down at one point?
I would say, I don't think it would really die down. I would say there was really not much going on for the longest, when going to school and everything here, we never really delved into the civil rights, and other than, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., but there wasn't, the National Memorial, and there wasn't really a lot of community dialogue and engagement, even as I got older, until the past, since I guess about 2018 is when it really started to pick up and become a thing.
Wow, interesting. Okay, thanks, Jay. Shelly, what about you? We'll start with the question about your community, and then I have a feeling that we can maybe go back to some of the answers that you both have given so far. But
yeah, it's so interesting because I immediately thought, which community are we talking about exactly? I live in Los Angeles, and I've lived in Los Angeles for, I think 30 years now. And they're so diverse. There's so many different people and so many different pockets, and there's a different flavor to so many different places and people. That said, it is it is LA, and therefore it's a lot of people in their cars, and therefore there is a lot of you have to decide to be around people if you are a middle class person who owns their own vehicle and is not using public transportation. And so, you're going to your job, you're going to, wherever you're planning to go, and can kind of select who you're around. So in the land of a lot of suburban living, I would say that my community can feel a little bit like disconnected, in that way, where I've happened to live in the same location for 20 years now. And so I know some of my neighbors, which is really great. But a lot of us live in our house, in our backyards. There isn't a lot of activity out in the front unless you're walking a dog in my particular neighborhood. So I think that does flavor a little bit of the community, which is, it's interacting with people you want to interact with. You can kind of avoid people you don't want to be around. And that's, that can be both easy and sad at the same time.
Easy and sad. It's interesting to think about life happening in the backyard where other people can't benefit or see, or I guess, the sense of privacy is important, but building the commonality and connecting might be a lot more challenging. You'd have to be super intentional, like you said. Interesting. My answer to either of those questions actually would be one thing that I think you definitely have in common is both of you saying yes to do something like this with some random stranger that you've met at the Memorial Center. And I'm committed to, both of you have your level of activism, right? And what you're committed to inside of the work that you do, inside of the interests that you have for the place where we all met, the EJI, Equal Justice Initiative. And then also, I think community-wise, I'm building a community through a podcast like this, really kind of helping break down some of the silos that we artificially erect around community. Part of it because for me, my dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot. So I had to build community constantly. And sometimes those were artificial, like, okay, we all happen to go to the same school. We all happen to be on the same team. We all happen to be, living in the same block. And so we would have to find really creative ways to build community so that experience of having been the new kid wasn't so raw every time, And even now, after many, many decades being on my own, and not having the military necessarily as the crutch, is I still have that need to build community. So I have a lot of it with my work, but now the dimensions have changed, right? The dimensions are no longer like if we all study the same thing or if we all live in the same, like, I don't even know some of the people that live around me. Like usually I'm like, I say, hi neighbor. I don't even know their names half the time. Like but it's an opportunity for me to create community with people who I think are doing things that are interesting. And that's what I think this podcast provides me, is like, people are doing interesting stuff. Let me have them have a conversation with each other. Maybe that can support something that they're each doing. So welcome to a new community.
Thank you.
In essence, yes. So what questions do you have for each other so far? We're pretty early on in this conversation. You probably have something that's piqued your interest about one another.
Yeah. Shelly, so what do you do, if you don't mind sharing? Like, how did you get into your passion for activism, or, being into social justice? I would assume that is something you're passionate about as well, coming to the memorial, and you say you're making it a point to come to the memorial. So I was wondering that.
Yeah. Long story cut down to the abbreviated version is that I started teaching elementary school in Inglewood, California, which is here in Southern California, a little bit south of LA. And it is that location where the people around me helped me to recognize that I was walking into that environment as a person with a race, a person with class background, both of which were influencing how I showed up. And it was quite a long journey of coming to grips with it meaning more than I really wanted it to mean. But what it led to was me actually fully taking on both the value and responsibility for having been on that journey. And it's sort of been my dedicated mission ever since coming to that place of reconciliation, that I realized I want to help support other people to more readily move on that journey for themselves in a way that is healthy and effective and productive, so that more people who have the background like I do are able to commit to racial justice.
Oh, that's awesome.
Shelley, could you give us an example or a story of something that you noticed, that you learned about yourself, or you learned about the community that influenced who you are and how you move now?
Yeah, there's so many, but one of them very particularly that will always stand out was I taught fifth grade at the time of this particular moment. So I was teaching fifth grade, and there's a young Black boy who was part of the foster care system. And we all knew that he had just moved through multiple different schools, multiple different locations. And so we knew he was having it rough, he was having a rough time. And I wanted so desperately for him to be successful. I wanted him to be the one to demonstrate all of his leadership skills. I saw the brightness in him, you know what I mean? And he was a smart kid. And I really wanted him to be able to do these like end of year, like celebratory speeches and things like that I thought he wanted to do, but he kept breaking the rules like over and over and over again. And so I kept giving chance after chance after chance because I didn't want to give up on him. You know what I mean? And then there was this one teacher who pulled me aside at one point and said, "You are doing damage to this child by not offering the appropriate boundaries. You in your white liberal guilt," and she didn't use those words, but basically said that, you're not holding him accountable and he's not going to learn the tools he needs to learn. And it was not in that exact moment, but it was that process that helped me understand that there's a big difference between being strict and loving and helping somebody formulate where they need to go to navigate where they are in the world, versus just being like nice and permissive.
Wow.
And that had a lot to do with what I then came to understand as, I don't want to say it this way, but it really was. It was like, oh, you poor kid, I need to do this thing for you. I had this investment in being the person who was going to help him be more than his circumstances were telling him he could be, right? So there was a certain level of my own identity process that was wrapped up in the way I was treating him, as opposed to honestly assessing what that child needed at that moment that was going to be best for him. And I was getting in the way of that.
Oh, fascinating. So I guess that's what people talk about, the savior, that savior mentality, right? And in this case, really putting the appropriate, and that's for anybody, right? Appropriate boundaries for children, appropriate boundaries for adults, appropriate boundaries. And we hear your dog in the background, Shelley. Don't even worry about it. But you've made an appropriate boundary for your dog.
That could be me.
Oh, is it you? Yeah.
It could be like mine. I think they're working outside my apartment building. So
okay. I heard a dog barking, but in any case, yeah, I think I hear what you're saying, and the focus really being what's best for the person, not only what's best for our sense of self, right? Our lowering our self-orientation in order to really be of service to other people where they're at, meeting people where they are. Interesting. Jay, what do you think about that? Anything to say or add to
I think that's very very awesome that you took that feedback and really looked into yourself to see that, okay, maybe I'm not really doing the best that I think I am, because there are people who sort of have that white savior sort of mentality, and it can be harming, when is it really helping, or is it you're doing it just for you to say, oh, I'm helping, someone underprivileged. So I think more people should do kind of a self-assessment like you did in that moment, and really look and see, am I really helping this person? Am I really helping someone who is underprivileged, who I want to see strive? That would be something everyone could learn to do more, just like more inner monologuing and see how am I being a better person and helping the community and helping others.
Mm. Jay, one of the conversations that you and I had, well, for those people, actually, we should probably start with this because we've mentioned EJI several times, and even just saying Equal Justice Initiative and Memorial Museum may mean nothing to a lot of people who are listening to this. So could you give us a flavor, both of you, since you both experienced it, give us a flavor of what it is, what it meant to you, and just to give people who are listening some context.
So the Equal Justice Initiative is the nonprofit that was founded by Brian Stevenson. His vision was for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice was to have America sort of recognize the atrocities that happen with slavery, how they have the Holocaust, museum and the apartheid and thing, and how those countries have acknowledged and, continue to acknowledge that this happened. It's America's version of that. And it's meant to honor those people who are passed from, racial terrorism and to open dialogue. And that was the one aspect of it. And then the museum is one of I feel like the really great part about the Museum of Memorial, because it takes the narrative from slavery to mass incarceration and how it's all connected. And when I first thought about it, I was like, well, how do you connect slavery to mass incarceration? And I was very curious to see how that was done. And the way that it's done with the separate eras and just going through the information, it was done very easily, and it was easy to comprehend, and you could see like, okay, throughout the years, racism and everything, the school to prison pipeline has created this racial systemic issues that we have. And so it's something I think everybody should experience because it's very informative. It's very emotional, but I think it's something that everyone should try to experience. And I think it's very well done how you connect, slavery to the mass incarceration, because like I said before, I was really like, oh, how are you gonna do that? But it was very well done, very thought out, and museum. It's incredible.
It really is. I would say by far in my top 3 now of museums and memorials that I've been to. And I've been to the Deutsche Geschichte Museum, the German History Museum in Bonn, Germany. I've been to the Holocaust Museum in DC. I've, as far as history goes, and I'm not like a big fan, I wouldn't sit there and study all the books. My brother is the encyclopedia reader of the family when we had those back in the day. But for me, it was really impactful, not only because of the way it was presented, but also so it was multimedia. I think it's very modern. I think it really brought life to data and facts, and not only the data, but also the human aspect. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, Shelly, I shared this with you when we all met, is it didn't hit me until that time. Because when you shared, Shelly, you told me that I think your focus has been on, was it reparations or was it the school to prison pipeline? I think it was, what was it? There was
a friend of mine has founded a fund.
Got it. Okay, got it. And but so you were sharing that, and then I think other people in your group were talking about some of those really huge systemic issues that you're fighting against. And whereas I think before going to the museum, I would have thought that's so much more powerful, that's much more impactful. It's not in my spirit to work at that level, with that particular level of justice. But what I saw when I walked through the museum and all the displays and the connection of the system to human, I found that the one thing that I saw, the thread, if you will, that I saw in common and not only with the racial terrorism, like you mentioned, Jay, but when I thought about the Holocaust, when I think of genocide, even if you think about the Rwandan genocide, was how we dissociated the humanity of these beings, right? These people who were terrorized became less than human. That was the moment in which all these different systems were able to grow and take root. And so I discovered through walking through that museum that my brand of activism is connection. And having conversations like this has always been something that I've been just compelled to do. I have a lot of conviction around, but I always found it was kind of like the soft side, right? It's like, it's not as powerful. It's not like I'm not there picketing and I'm not out there, you know, trying to lobby for certain things, but I found validation when I walked through that museum, because I was like, man, if people could understand the humanity of everyone involved in these systems, then perhaps we can start. It would be harder to implement some of the things that people were implementing. It would be harder, you know, not only harder, but it would be completely inappropriate, and likely we will be more courageous in questioning when things come up, because we have a connection to the humanity, not only ourselves, but others. So that's what I walked away with. That's why I thought it was such a powerful experience. I'm so grateful I got to meet the two of you in the process. So okay, I would love to hear, Shelly, your reactions to what Jay shared, what I shared, anything around that.
Yeah, I think what's just coming up for me is what you just named, which I have related to that as well. Like, what's my brand of activism? What's my contribution? I think about, well, number one, I have come to a place where I think it all counts. You know, like all of it is important. And, you know, if we just bring our best of ourselves to it, that's going to be the way that it is best done. Because if we bring the best of ourselves, right, then that's more effective. But also it does feel like that there are critiques out there that says here's the right way to do something, or, you know, here's the most important way to do activism or whatnot. And I just think all of it matters. I wrote this one piece. It's called On Ramps and Lanes on the Racial Justice Freeway. And the whole idea of it is like, we have to just find our lane. Like, what's the way that we now.
Uh-oh, Shelly, I think we lost your connection. Okay, well, we'll reconnect with Shelly in just a moment. I think we have lost her connection there. Jay, you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so we had a little bit of a blip there with our connection, but I'm an activist for connection. So of course I'm gonna pause and make sure that we reconnect. So Shelly, you're back, good. Jay, I think the question was, what is it like to work at EJI, right? Obviously it's a really powerful message that it's giving to the community about this particular, you know, the systems that have been in place for, you know, everything from slavery to the prison to the mass incarceration pipeline. So what's it like for you as a person being surrounded by that every day, all day?
So, you know, when I was one of the first classes of people to start working there before it opened. So I would go back and forth from the museum to the memorial. I would say working in the memorial, due to the content and stuff, like for a while, it gets to you emotionally, but you know, I wouldn't say you kind of phase it out, but you look at it as like, okay, this is more than me and my emotions. So you sort of build a resiliency and things like that. And so that way, when people come through, you know, we have a lot of people, international, local, everywhere, and a lot of the information that we have, you know, they want to know more. And we're there to answer questions as best we can. There's just a wide range of emotions and questions that we get. You know, usually if someone's very emotional, again, we're very supportive. We let them, you know, say, if you need to take a moment, go ahead and feel free to step out, you know, just, you know, grab a wristband. You're more than welcome to come in, because we know, and it's made aware that the content can be very heavy, and some people need it in doses. You know, and when it comes to, you know, the crying and thing, of course, you know, we're like, you know, it's okay. It was strength that brought you here. And then we have I've had a few situations where people have come out of the museum or the memorial and they ask questions like, do you hate all white people for this? And those are the questions that I kind of stop and say, you know, it makes me pause for a moment. And because you go through this experience and it's not meant for anyone to feel like, oh, they should be hated or anything. It's meant to tell the story and present history as it is with the facts. And so it's meant to create dialogue and let people come together and talk about it in their way. So when your first response, and I'm not saying people aren't entitled to think what they think or feel how they feel in that moment. It's just, I think there's better ways to start dialogue than, oh, do you hate all white people now? And, you know, I have to say, you know, of course, working there, I have to remain professional, even though I'm thinking like, why would you ask that? Why would you ask me that? No, you know, like, and I tell them, I said, well, no, I don't hate you. Why would I? You came here. That's a big step. That says a big thing for you to actually take the time to come here. So I don't hate you for that. I actually applaud you for that. I actually applaud you for staying through the whole, you know, the whole walkthrough and going to the memorial and everything. And you shouldn't feel that way. It's not meant for you to feel that way. It's not meant to, you know, for you to go and think like, oh no, all black people are gonna hate me. No, that's not the intent. And so with that, it kind of sort of is like, for me personally, it's sort of like, well, you went through this emotional journey, right? This experience. But you came out and it's kind of like your question is making it about you and yourself. And so it's like, what did you take? Did you really take the message that it was meant to be portrayed as when you're coming back and like, oh, white people are horrible, or do you hate white people? Were you really paying it? That's my thing. Were you really paying attention then? To me, that should kind of be the first thought that comes to somebody's mind, especially coming up to an employee and be like, hey, you hate white people?
I think, you know, so just to give people some context who haven't been into the museum, because so much of it is devoted to, first of all, slavery being an economic system that was established, and so many people that, was it 12 point something million?
Yes.
Yeah, 12.1 million slaves from African slaves, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, transatlantic slave trade. And then the economics behind it and all of the businesses that boomed and the family wealth that grew out of that, you know, from white Europeans, right, that were involved in this process. So that's one aspect of it. And then you talk about the Jim Crow South and all the segregation, the history of segregation and the systemic extermination of many Black people because of some of the laws that were quite arbitrary that were set up, right? As you mentioned, racial terrorism. So there's so much of that depicted in very, very graphic ways in some cases too, that you can't help but walk away knowing this is what a group of people did to another group of people. And these are the facts and here's the history. And so I'm wondering, with the reaction that you said you were getting, people asking now, do you hate white people or something like that, coming from a place of shame and guilt, or right, probably those are the big two. And not to take anything away from the gravity of that topic, but I know when I talk to my mom, for example, about things in my childhood that I was dissatisfied with, like this thing happened and then this happened and you and dad didn't, and she would all of a sudden say, was I a bad mom? Or did you just hate your childhood or something? I'm like, no, it was just this moment. But hear in her question some sort of like just self-flagellation, like she's really questioning her own her motherhood, right? Her approach to motherhood that somehow provoked whatever I was judging. So I think that's the connection I'm making to what you're saying, that perhaps there's some of that. But Shelly, I'm curious, obviously you're white, you went through it, you're studying and you've been experiencing some of this. What did you walk away with, or what have you heard other people walk away with?
Well, I'll be honest, this is like the thing I do is research this particular topic,
Yeah.
which is the racial identity process for white people. And I mean, I really appreciate what you said, Valerie, about like so many of us, when we come to that first awareness of how bad it really was and the systemic part, like the wish and the hope, I think, for white people is that we will understand the system of it, and that we will decide, wow, here's this whole system that's never actually been good and clean. How do we disrupt the system? How do we shift the system, right? And too much frustration, the typical response isn't about really seeing the system, it's about, what does this mean about me? How am I related to this thing? And if I haven't figured out what my relationship is in a way that allows me to feel decent about myself, I go into that place. Well, you must hate everybody. You must hate me. What do I can't even treat you like a full human being right now. You're just a person of color in front of me because I'm so filled with my emotions. Like, that's what happens in our heads so much at a particular status point, you know. The hope and the wish is that we continue on a journey and get hooked up with people who are helping us to do the kind of self-evaluation and action that allows us to create an identity around being against that system, and being one of the people who throughout our history has worked to improve things and move it towards justice. And when we can adopt that as an identity and feel honest about that being true for us, and we know enough, then we stop saying those sorts of things. You know, and we stop being that level of frustrating and disappointing, you know, quite frankly. But that is very typically often where it starts is with ourselves, and that is absolutely not what these spaces are intended to do. And it's a reflection of where we are in our own identity process.
You know, I watched this, I went through this online tour. This company did these online tours, and this particular one was done in Kyiv, Ukraine. This is prior to the beginning of the war, sometime last year. And the person that was guiding the tour, she went through, I can't remember the name of the place, but in this particular location, she was walking through and sharing the history of it. And that particular place had witnessed the extermination of 30,000 Jews during World War II. And they were deceived in coming to this particular location and literally mowed down. And one of the things that she mentioned that stood out to me in her description of and sharing of the history, and I've not gone back to research it on my own, so I don't know how much of this was factual, how much of it was her interpretation. So just sharing what she shared, one of the things that she mentioned that stood out to me was how many of the soldiers, of the Nazi soldiers that were responsible for executing all these citizens from their community, many of them either killed themselves, some, not many, but some killed themselves, some became very ill. Because I can't imagine what it does to the soul of another human being to be a part of exterminating another person, right? Especially in such a systemic way. I would imagine someone who has a family member or friend who committed some heinous crime that created trauma for someone, whether that was molestation, rape, or some, a serial killer who has a family who's now left with, what do we do now with all of this? And I was so curious about that. Like what, and when I saw in the museum, the things that we talked about, displayed around the lynching, and how those were like carnival atmospheres where people were taking photographs and making postcards of people being lynched and taking body parts, things like that. Like, how does one sit around the dinner table and on both sides of the trauma, right? The victim and also the perpetrator. What do you do with that? how does one continue to live life in a place where it's an empowering context after having seen that or heard that, or knowing that your neighbor disappeared and is never to be heard from again, and then you saw a picture or heard people talking about a picture, or knowing that your cousin or uncle or father participated in this event? Like, I was left with so many questions about that.
And,
Go, yeah.
And just to add on, like, we do have quite a few people who come in and they're very open, like, my family member owned slaves, and this is kind of my way of coming through and trying to come to terms that someone in my family did this brutality to another human being. And again, I always say it takes a lot of strength and for you to come in and take it all in. I think when people hear about it and see about the museum and memorial, there's not a lot of inside things. So I don't think they really expect the kind of emotional explosion that you will have going through it. But I also think, like, the people who come in and say, I have family members who were part of this, and I just had to come through and witness, like, how could my family, do such a horrible thing, and learn how can I be a better person for my family. And, they're like, I've gained so much from awful slavery and everything. So what can I do to make things just? And at that point, it's just, you're starting. By coming here, you're starting. And from there, you just continue to search and find and work your way till you get to a place where you feel that you are making the change. And just like I said, my first thing is I always tell people, you're making a change just by simply coming here.
Just starting the journey.
Yeah.
Why did you guys even start getting, well, Shelley, it sounds like you may have something you want to share. Go for it. I have another question, but go.
Well, it's more complicated for me, it seems, because I'm one of those white people who don't have ancestral feet in the US far enough to know that they participated in any way. And so folks like myself so often, and I remember this in my 20s, well, my family didn't own slaves, right? So it's kind of like it divorced myself from needing to take into account, like, how I've either still been complicit with the system, or still benefited from a system, or still benefited from the unending work. And that's what was so powerful for me about the museum, was the way that it, room by room, allowed you to see the uninterrupted trauma.
Yeah.
And so regardless of when my parents or grandparents or great-grandparents set foot on what we now have as US territory, they entered a space which was diabolically injurious, particularly to Black folks, which is, the focus of the museum. And so there is no place for white people to escape that in this museum. And I think that's really important. I think it's powerful. And I think it calls those of us who, are in the community that I'm in to be looking deeper at that question you asked about. So what does it mean for me to be raised in a society that is giving me a lot of messages about not needing to identify with race unless I feel like it, or at least until recently. I think things are starting to shift because things are so prominent right now. But my generation, the generation after me, and multiple generations before, I think we had this opposite racial identity experience that didn't become clear to me till I started going to workshops, where we'd have mixed race rooms of people, right? And they would ask the question, so when's the first time you realized you were a part of your race? When's the first time you realized that that was meaningful, meaning it was going to affect your life? And most of the folks of color, regardless of background, were like 4, 5, 6, something like that. And, half the room of white folks are like, at 25, 42, like, I still don't know, I mean, it's just a totally, it was, and I don't know, I mean, today is so hot right now for young people. I don't know how young people aren't gonna see it as salient and meaningful, but it's been so much like racial literacy was not part of my upbringing. I did not get raised in a way that helped me have a race conversation. It was not until my mid-20s when I started very not elegantly, inelegantly, like trying to have these conversations. And I'm sure I was super frustrating. I was probably one of those people, Jay, where you'd have been like, I'm absolutely sure of it. And and it wasn't just me, who like, oh, thankfully I had some kind of special gene that made me pay attention to feedback. It wasn't like that. It's that people took me under their wing. People were patient with me. There were a good number of folks who supported me when I was crying, about really, really finding it hard to work through the emotions that came up with wanting to see myself as a good person, wanting to be a good person and trying to figure out, okay, I'm dedicated to being a good person. And if that means some things need to shift, okay, fine. But now I don't know what to do. And, and there's kind of a little bit of fun often made of people who are just saying, just tell me what to do. Because there is no like easy 10-point list. There is no thing that you can say that's like, here's all, if you just do these things, everything's going to be fine and you're not going to bother people anymore. And you're actually going to be a real like dedicated, useful, member of anti-racism or something. It's just not that easy. But man, it comes from a heart place that really not only wants it to be easier, but also wants to be effective right away. So all of that is what's coming up for me as you tell your story.
I think that's important, though. I think it's important to ask questions when you're unsure. If you're curious, it's great to ask those questions. And, it's all about the tone. So I'm a person, I fully believe that you could have a conversation with anyone. You may not have the same beliefs or everything. For example, I have a neighbor who's like big libertarian and everybody's like, I don't see how y'all are friends, but we're good, we have conversations. And I think when you have those dialogues with her and, for example, she's like, I never realized my own white privilege until I started talking to you. And I said, but now you know. And what you take with it is you learn and you grow and you try to be more cognizant of the things that you do or the things that you say, and I said, but you don't have to be like, oh, you can't say words. She's like, am I allowed to say hot sauce? And can I give somebody hot sauce? And I'm like, you can give somebody hot sauce. It's not gonna be like just, you're doing great. It's the acknowledgement that is the important part. And again, I think that everything with Museum and More is meant to bring about that type of dialogue in a civil and, mannerable way. And working there we shouldn't, no one there is offended by questions. It may jar us for a moment, you know what I'm saying? Especially when it's like, oh, where did that come from? But it's always gonna be, well, like I said, you took the time, you came, it's a start. That's the important thing. You're asking questions, you're asking, what can I do more? And like Shelly was saying, there's no 10-point list. I can't give it. I don't know. I said, but reach out to other people, go out in your community, you know what I mean? Learn more about what's going on in your community and how you can help, underprivileged and children or, anything like that, to just learn and grow from it, from this experience. This is a seed that you can take to grow from.
Yeah, I think both of you made some really interesting points about the experience on both sides, right? Of being in as a host, right? Jay as a host, and then Shelly, you as a participant or an audience member of the public coming in to partake. What I think is interesting is, first of all, I think our society really does appreciate, like, just tell me what to do and how to do it. Oftentimes, it's an easy approach. I mean, we're like that with medicine. Just give me the pill. Like, let me not go through the thing. I don't want to go through the process. Do I want to go to therapy? No. Do I want to talk about it with my family? No. Let me just fix it, right? There's a fix it mentality that I think it sometimes comes to the surface. But I know I didn't realize I was Black until I was 14. And that's because my family were immigrants to this country. And although there was some of that, I didn't know this until much later, but in Panama, which is where I'm originally from, the Republic of Panama, the Panama Canal was built by the US Army. Many of the people in the Army at that time were from the South. And so they'd established segregation in the canal, in a foreign country. Right? Well, the canal was known as US property. That was the US territory. And so my mother would share that my grandfather never talked about it. So that's probably why I didn't really get much of it. Or if he did, I was not aware of the impact of it, but they would call it silver and gold, right? Rather than black and white or colored and white, they would say silver and gold. So Blacks or foreigners were paid in silver, whites were paid in gold. That was part of it back then in the early 1900s. So I thought that was fascinating. And so many of the rules, as far as the division of access to restrooms and water fountains and all the same things that you would see in the Jim Crow South were also in effect in, right, a foreign country. And so those are the kind of things that I remember they experienced then, but we didn't grow up that way. We grew up very integrated into Panamanian culture. My great-grandparents were from the West Indies, from the Caribbean islands. And it wasn't until we moved to the US when my father joined the military, I was 9 years old, and we lived on bases. And on military bases, that conversation doesn't come up. Like we said, I had to create your artificial community because all of us were coming from someplace else. And it wasn't until I went to high school in Alabama, I went to high school and college in Alabama, where I saw first day in the cafeteria in high school, 9th grade year, were all Black students on one side and white students on the other side. And I'd never seen that outside of a civil rights movie. So it was shocking to me. I'm like, oh, like this is a thing, but it's the 80s. This is not like, civil rights movies of the 60s. What's going on? And I think that was a learning experience for me. And I'm still learning a lot of things about, well, what is my responsibility, even as an immigrant, right, of African descent? How do I show up? Well, how do I educate, not only myself, but then those in my family? I have children, the kids in my family, I have nieces and nephews who are mixed race. And so how does that happen? How do they identify? How do they reconcile their whiteness and their Blackness? So there's so many conversations about this that we could take. I think a big piece of what I heard the two of you share, at least imply, is so much of it starts within, right? It starts within figuring out why is it that we want to do, how do we want to approach it? So that takes me to my next question is, why did you all decide to do the things that you're doing? Shelly, why are you committed to this, knowing that this isn't necessarily something that your ancestors were involved in the slavery movement? And Jay, you were raised in Alabama. I'm sure you probably have family history that was directly impacted by some of the terrorism that took place. Like, why did you guys say yes to doing more of this deeper?
Well, growing up, so I would say my experience is a little different. So I grew up suburban. I grew up in the suburbs, and it was single mom in suburbs. It was a community subdivision of it was a very small subdivision, and there was only maybe like 4 Black families. And it was there that I kind of realized, oh, I'm not the same, you're not the same, but it's like you see the differences, right? And then there's kind of like undertones there, like when you go to a friend's house and they're just kind of like, what are you doing here, And so from there, And then going, living in that situation and then going to private school, it was sort of like a bit of an identity crisis for me too, because it was like, well, where do I fit in? Because some of the kids were like, oh, well, you speak so well. Do you want to be white? And, it was like, oh, well, it's kind of like I didn't fit in with either side, because once I was like, oh, you act and you talk white. And for me, I never understood it. And I was like, I don't get what that means, but I identify as Black. So what's the issue? And then, there would be the kids who would say like the microaggressions, like, oh, you're so smart for a Black guy, or, well, you speak so well to be Black. And you're just like, what? What? And taking that and growing up in that situation, it kind of made me want to understand, people more and our history more. And fortunately, my mom and my aunt really did a lot of great work in teaching me about, my culture, African American history and everything. And so I just kind of ended up doing nonprofit work for a local community here in Montgomery, and it led to working with another larger nonprofit, which branched off here. So it kind of, my experiences of people in the community and seeing people, who may not fit in exactly box or bubble is what kind of inspired me to go out and work with different communities and everything.
Or to understand even better. That's interesting, Jay. Thank you. Shelley, what drove you?
Yeah, I want to be careful the way I say this, because on one hand, my commitment to racial justice is about it having a just world where everybody gets to be valued, and everybody gets to be fully valued and gets to be the fullness of who they can be in the world, so their gifts can shine, like point, like stop. And at the same time, for me personally, I think what's become so important and what helps drive me the way that I do it is that I figured out that, Valerie, it's a lot of what you said before about, so what does it mean for a person to recognize that they're attached to something that's so awful, and I feel really strongly that I have a personal stake, my own humanity is wrapped up in living in a more healthy society. Like, I don't think living in a racist society is healthy, even for white people. I understand that the scope and severity of the trauma is a whole different kind of thing, but I can do a whole long list of the way I think that white people are not well served by this whole setup, in terms of our emotional life, in terms of our community life, in terms of our cultural life, and even in terms of the ills of society. I think that racism makes all of that worse. We wouldn't have so many of the issues that we had if we had a more equitable society. And so I want me to be a person who lives in a not racist environment. I want my family to live in a not racist environment, as much as I want other people also not to deal with the abuse and the trauma. So for me, it's personal stake on a spiritual level. It's also very practical. It's all of the things. And because it's all of the things, like my little position within my little world of like anti-racist white people is like, I say like, I'm the Pollyanna of like white anti-racist people, because it's very positive and optimistic. It's like, look, we can do this, we can be better, we can do better. And we don't have to feel bad about ourselves. That's not number one, the point. It's not the ask. It's actually like, we can feel good about being anti-racist people in the world. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not about finding goodness, but it is about finding just a healthier way of being. And quite frankly, we're better with each other too. There's a couple of like books that so lay this out. Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Messel. Oh my gosh, it lays out the way that white people are actually like, we're really injuring ourselves when we as a collective invest in racist policies and things. Like, you don't see it right away, and that shouldn't be the whole point, but it's true and we should look at it. And then a super new one, Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. Man, this metaphor is deep. She talks about this whole history of how, and this hits Jay, the work, of Legacy Museum, and how when the desegregation orders came down, whole bunches of white communities that used to invest in things like big, beautiful community pools and things like that, community orientation, filled in the community pools with concrete instead of desegregating them. And so that is a metaphor for the things that white racism has done, like writ large. That's why my neighbors exist in the backyard. This is the, like, how this all wraps up together, you know, like the separations, the isolations, and a lot of the like mental illnesses that are like made worse by separations and isolations and not having extra supports. It's like all that stuff is wrapped up in racism. So yeah, every day I want racism to end, because I don't think it's serving anybody, including me. So that's my why.
That's the Pollyanna of racism.
I love it.
Amen. Man, I feel like we're just starting to scratch the surface. That usually happens when we have these types of conversations. But as we're kind of wrapping up our time together, I'm curious about, what do you guys get out of our conversation today?
I think it was very wonderful. It was great to meet Shelly. I actually would love to connect with her outside of here, because I have so many more questions, and I would love to know more about, you know, her work. And she said something, a word that showed you, like, equity. And, you know, I think equity plays a very important part of equality, you know, and it seems like what you do is something that I could take from in my community, and when I'm, you know, ask questions like, oh, do you hate, or, you know, we're horrible, and better than, you know, have a better response than, you know, it's a genuine response, but it's just like, it throws you off, you know? So it's like, I would love to talk to you more about how do you have those discussions and those things like that. And I'm very grateful to have been part of that. You know, Shelly can be a world of information for me. So I am ready to learn.
You muted yourself, Shelly.
Sorry.
Is that your dog? What are you doing?
Yeah, well,
Okay.
somebody just came, I am sitting right next to my door, and somebody just came to the door, and my dog is unhappy about that.
Oh, got it. What's your dog's name?
Her name is Allie, and she's a wonderful guard puppy here.
Allie.
But just really quickly, Jay, I just, you know, to match out, like, I'm also, I thought this has been a really great conversation. I agree. It's like we just, you know, scratched the surface of all that we could be talking about. And, you know, the fact that you see people coming in and out day after day, like I arrived to the museum and the memorial with a group of about 11 multiracial folks. And I saw how we had different reactions based on our background, and how we had to hold, you know, each other in terms of, you know, making space and room for people to have different emotional responses and stuff like that. And so what you've witnessed, I'd be curious to hear more about, like, the patterns of that.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I feel like we need a part 2, because I know, Shelly, you didn't get to ask Jay a question. Actually, you know what? We have a moment. If you guys don't, I know we hit our time limit, but do you guys have a few extra minutes?
I need to talk to this person who's
okay,
standing
got it. No worries, Shelly. We'll have a part 2 for sure, because I do think that there's still even more to unpack there. But I want to just say how grateful I am to the two of you for your conversation today. I do have a couple of asks. One is, do you have a question that you would like for the next guests to answer? And if so, what is it? It could be about anything, because the conversation will go wherever it goes.
I think I'd be curious for you to ask somebody what they think they're going to get out of the conversation.
Okay. Good.
I am drawing a blank right now, to be honest with you.
All right. If you don't have a question, Jay, maybe, is there a challenge that you would pose to the audience? Maybe who's been listening? Is there something that you'd like to say, hey, do this, or try this?
I do actually. I would like to challenge the next person or whomever to show compassion to someone that they normally wouldn't show compassion to. Maybe someone they don't really get along with at work or outside of things. Just try to be nice and be compassionate and see how things go.
Okay.
Get
Show
out their comfort
compassion.
zone. Yeah.
Show compassion out of the comfort zone to someone that you would not typically show compassion to.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you both so very much for your time and energy on this podcast. And for those of you who tuned in today, thanks again for joining us for an episode of Not Quite Strangers. Make sure that you subscribe or like us, love us, whatever, follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you don't miss a single episode. Jay, Shelly, you have been fantastic. Thank you both again so much for what you shared. And before we leave, let's make sure we schedule some time for a part 2. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
You've been listening to the podcast Not Quite Strangers. Be sure to subscribe or follow on your favorite video or podcast platform. And for more information and content, go to notquitestrangers.com. See you next time.